Here is perhaps the greatest irony in geopolitics at the moment. Russia's resurgence in, how to put this, military adventurism is empowering Europe in a way that we have never seen before. And for all of Trump's complaints about NATO over the past decade, because this resurgence comes in the midst of China's longer-term rise on the international stage, the United States needs NATO now more than ever. Yes, more than the days of the Cold War. Certainly more than that wonderful period of calm known as the 1990s. And even more than that time that NATO invoked Article 5, following an attack on the United States. I know that may seem weird looking at the headlines, where it appears that the United States is the one making the demands vis-a-vis Europe. Usually that would be a sign that the United States is the one with all of the bargaining power. But not this time. Most of the discussion surrounding US lobbying to get Europe to increase defense spending focuses on Washington's free-riding criticism. Here, though, it also reflects how the United States needs genuine help now. And I think that understanding why is central to understanding what the current geopolitical environment looks like overall, because this oddly does not happen without Russia. Now, the good news is that the situation is well understood by those on the inside, and we will talk later about the subtle restructuring of NATO to address the evolution later in this video. And if you have been staying current on all of the behind-the-scenes policymaking in the United States that I have covered in the last few months, you likely have an intuitive understanding of this already. But in terms of the general public's knowledge, the situation is entirely opaque. And there are still some lingering questions about how Europe will leverage its increased bargaining power in the future. So join me today as we go through a journey through time and across continents, as we bring the greatest irony into the light. As a starting point, let's go back to the actual starting point. Remember this old chap? It is Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO. You might also recall how he summarized the purpose of the organization: to keep the Russians out and the Americans in. Oh, and there was also something about keeping the Germans down, but we have moved well beyond that. Yeah, weird is the world where both Western and Eastern Europe have formed a consensus that it is okay if Germany has the most powerful military on the continent. Anyway, back to Lord Ismay. Europe needed the United States. The Soviet Union was just too powerful of a military entity for those countries ravaged by World War II to resist. Well, at least not without the backing of the United States, which was still enjoying a prosperous life across the pond after being practically untouched during the war. That is how you ended up with American tanks patrolling places as far-flung as West Berlin. The United States also benefited from the relationship, of course. Washington did not want to see the Soviet Union achieve world domination, and Europe would be the launching point for that. NATO partners indeed contributed financially and materially to the effort, and the United States further benefited from having European territory to place forward operating bases on. But the relationship was very much one-sided. Now, in a moment, I will discuss the one time that NATO invoked its Article 5 provision. However, it was hard for me to track down some key quotes about the United States' position. It turns out that the corpus of human knowledge is massive, and I am just one man. But there is a great tool that helped me find the right sources. Not quotes, but real sources that I could cross-reference. Actually, it is today's sponsor, Chat LLM Teams. AI is much better at understanding abstract requests like US sentiment about Article 5 than traditional search engines are. However, the proliferation of AI services makes it difficult to know which to use. Chat LLM Teams simplifies your dilemma by automatically rerouting your prompt to the service best suited for your needs. Plus, it gives you access to more techie tools like image, video, and code generation. And you can get all of this for only $10 per month, way less than paying for each individual service's credits. So go to chatllm.abacus.ai or click the link in the description to try it out. And thanks again to them for sponsoring today's video. Moving on, post-Cold War, the relationship evened out, but that was mostly a result of how the general threat level had dissipated worldwide. Europe no longer needed the United States because the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, and it would be a long time before Russia got its act together again. At the same time, though, it was not like the United States grew to rely more on Europe. In fact, Europe's defense spending tanked even harder than US defense spending over that period. Now, that did not stop the United States from looking to Europe when it was convenient. This was the era of the New World Order. So when the Clinton administration wanted to intervene in Kosovo, it went through NATO as a means to establish more international legitimacy. Ultimately, though, it left US military brass with frustration that they were fighting a war by committee, a concern that would have far-reaching consequences. And that takes us to an episode from this time period that perfectly encapsulates Washington's attitude toward NATO, and it is one that I observe being misunderstood all the time. If you are watching this channel, then you probably already know that NATO's Article 5 collective security provision has been triggered exactly once, provisionally on September 12, 2001, and then confirmed on October 2nd. Following through on their treaty commitments, many NATO countries would indeed send troops to assist the United States in Afghanistan. Given those historical facts, you might be inclined to say that it was the United States who invoked Article 5. And as shorthand, I guess that is okay. I myself have probably said something to that effect at some point in my life. But for this conversation, we need some precision. It would be better to say that NATO invoked Article 5, and the United States kind of just went along with it. The basic sentiment within the Bush administration was, we're America. We can do everything by ourselves. We don't need anyone else. Meanwhile, the sentiment within NATO was that it would set a bad precedent if something that met the Article 5 bar did not receive the Article 5 treatment. Remember that Article 5 is the very definition of an incomplete contract. Whatever happened next would be the only reference point for future attacks, if, say, Europe were struck, and Europe really wanted a forceful response. However, the Bush administration did not want the United States to fight another war by committee, so it went along with the process to again enhance international legitimacy. But as an anonymous US official said at the time, it's safe to say that we won't be asking the Supreme Allied Commander Europe to put together a battle plan for Afghanistan. Summarizing the situation, Tommy Franks, the US general in charge of the invasion of Afghanistan, said that he doesn't have the time to become an expert on the Danish Air Force. Secretary of State Colin Powell seemed like the only one with a more upbeat attitude about the situation. The United States would appreciate the effort, but did not find it strictly necessary. And so, in typical NATO fashion, a consensus formed. The alliance, not the United States specifically, but the alliance generally, would invoke Article 5 in a show of solidarity. Meanwhile, the United States had 8 specific requests for its partners. 1. To increase intelligence sharing. 2. To immediately clear U.S. aircraft for transit. 3. To give assistance to countries that may be vulnerable to similar attacks. 4. To add security to U.S. facilities in allied nations. 5. To backfill materiel that the United States sent to Afghanistan. 6. To approve access to NATO ports and airfields. 7. To place NATO members' naval forces along the eastern Mediterranean. And 8. To deploy a NATO Airborne Early Warning and Control System, or AWACS, to the United States. This was one of the only pieces of hardware that NATO itself owns. Flying over the United States was a relatively safe mission, but it freed up US AWACS for more dangerous missions abroad. A bunch of countries would also eventually join the prolonged war effort. Denmark notably had more fatalities per capita in Afghanistan than the United States did. And all casualties that the coalition suffered reduced the ultimate burden that the United States paid. Nevertheless, Washington's attitude was that NATO assistance provided a fringe benefit. It was not central to the mission. Not much has changed regarding the US public's perception of NATO in the meantime. When I went to the NATO summit last month, I was with a group of almost all Europeans. A bunch of them asked me the same question. What do Americans think about NATO? And the best answer that I could give is that we, well, don't. I understand that might sound a bit crazy from a European perspective. Only a few countries on the continent can begin to think about defense strategy outside of the alliance. And obviously, though I am not without fault, I personally spend a lot of time thinking about the organization. But stateside, the gap begins in the American education system. High school history classes are notorious for ending at World War II, and if anything gets taught after that, they are blasting right through the next 80 years. Thus, inside of the classroom, some US students may never reach a time period where NATO existed. Or, if they did, they may have some nebulous idea that it was a coalition from the Cold War meant to counter the Soviet Union, and nothing more than that. Indeed, up until a decade ago, it was still a passing thought in the US public's consciousness. The United States was fully capable of fighting wars on its own after all, so at best, NATO might be a footnote. Consequently, pre-Trump, you were either old enough to remember the Cold War, or you barely thought about NATO at all. I said a second ago that I am not without fault. Well, time for me to own up to that. When I was a grad student, I knew what NATO was, of course, but I did not think that alliance politics was something worth studying. You could treat it the same as a country and move on with your research. It's just a bunch of countries together and nothing more than that. Actually, I can remember a time when my co-author and sometimes interview guest Brad Smith first told me that he was interested in studying alliances. I did not have the heart to tell him that I did not think that there was much worthwhile there. And it would not be until the end of my time in grad school that Brad had written some interesting papers on the subject, which eventually changed my mind. In that light, it is all the worse that over the last decade, the main exposure that US citizens have regarding NATO is Trump's frustration with European freeriding, especially because it comes at a time when the United States needs NATO now more than ever. And yeah, European countries did indeed free ride for a long period of time. Just look at NATO's own report on military spending over this period, way below a bar that the Allies set for themselves. Now, to be sure, the United States was still getting something in return during that period. But again, Russia's resurgence means that the United States must rely on Europe all the more. And that takes us to the main discussion item for today. Exactly why the United States needs NATO now more than ever. Because I keep saying Russia, but that is not actually it. Instead, I can summarize the basic idea with the image of a different flag. Hello, China. If we drill down further, the geographical factors at play create a more complicated story. As a starting point, the US economy ceases to function without a functional European Union. They form the world's largest trading partnership, and we have previously discussed just how complicated global supply chains can get. The problem is that the United States also needs a functional Indo-Pacific region. After neighboring Mexico and Canada, China is the United States' third largest partner, narrowing our focus to just countries rather than trade blocs. Japan is 5th, South Korea is 6th, Taiwan is 7th, Vietnam is 8th, and India is 10th. Together, those Indo-Pacific countries get in the ballpark of the US trade relationship with the European Union. Clearly, if the United States had to choose one, it would be the European Union. But the world is more interconnected than that. There are threats everywhere, including to Europe. But the biggest threat of all to global, not regional but global stability, are the tensions between China and Taiwan. And that includes European stability. After the United States, China is the European Union's second largest trading partner. Japan is 7th, South Korea is 10th, Taiwan is 13th, and Vietnam is 17th. And bear in mind that those numbers ignore the aforementioned global supply chains, where disruption in one location has knock-on effects elsewhere regardless of the bilateral figures. The point is, there is a dynamic world to defend. It was not always like this. Back during the Cold War, Europe was the prize and everything else was a luxury. Consequently, you would see the United States embark on some side quests in places like Korea and Vietnam, but Europe always remained the focus. And throughout that period, the United States benefited from the contributions that other NATO allies made. At the same time, though, the United States did not need to ask as much of Europe because it was Washington's key priority. The Soviet Union was the United States' main competitor. The Soviet Union was already halfway into Europe, and so the United States had to meet the Soviet Union there. Today is a different world. China is now the United States' main competitor, and it is on the opposite side of the world. If the United States wants to meet that challenge, then it must shift its assets accordingly. At the same time, though, Russia remains a threat to Europe, and a catastrophe on the European continent remains a catastrophe for the United States. But all thanks to China, the game board has become far more complex. You can see recognition of this in how NATO has operated for the past few years. Now, the organization's membership is limited. It is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, after all, emphasis on the North Atlantic part. Indeed, by Article 10 of the North Atlantic Treaty, Indo-Pacific partners need not apply. But this puts NATO in a weird position. The geographic limitation is an artifact of its original purpose, to keep the Soviet Union out of Europe. To wit, Portugal was still a quarter century away from democratizing when it became a founding member in 1949. Since the end of the Cold War, though, NATO has transitioned to focusing on protecting the Western liberal order more broadly. That makes sense. Despite its apparent military foundations, NATO as an organization owns virtually no military hardware, those radar planes from earlier excluded. Its Brussels headquarters serves as the primary way for like-minded governments to meet at the ambassadorial level when issues arise, and they politically organize themselves there. Eventually, they may begin coordinating militarily, but if there is ever actual military movement, the organization has already failed in some ways. Deterrence and all that. The problem is that the Western liberal order does not have the same geographic constraint that the treaty has. Thus, NATO must get creative with its Indo-Pacific partners, who coordinate with the alliance politically, but are not subject to Article 5 protection. For example, in 2017, NATO moved out of its longtime headquarters. What you are watching is the flags coming down one final time, and they had to haul them all the way across the street to the glass building that you can see in the background. Now, the current headquarters was a necessary upgrade. NATO had added 13 members since the opening of the previous headquarters in 1967. But that left a perfectly functional building behind. Well, many of the partner countries now occupy that space. All they need to do is cross the road to get in contact. Specifically, NATO's Indo-Pacific partners are Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Taiwan, despite NATO's open concerns about a PRC invasion, does not participate because of the trickiness of the One China policy, but the informal planning still remains there. Meanwhile, the official partners have been attending foreign ministers' meetings since 2020, even if they do not get to be a part of the family photos. And their heads of state started going to the corresponding annual summits in 2022. Part of this reflects how it is important to get everyone on the same standards. You can see the benefits of that from South Korea shipping 155mm artillery shells to Ukraine. The other bit is an increasing belief that a major war involving Russia and Europe implies a major war between China and Taiwan, and vice versa. As has become a common theme on this channel for the last few months, the tricky thing is that the United States does not have the bandwidth to handle both at once. Hence why the United States needs NATO now more than ever, not just to coordinate a two-front war, but also for Europe to pick up the slack. This would not be a wholly new experience. When the United States went to Korea, Europe did something similar, precisely out of a concern that the Soviet Union might exploit the situation. And we already discussed how Europe backfilled materiel following the US deployment to Afghanistan. It is just that today's task will be much, much bigger. There is something strange about all of this, though. Hence, we need to conclude with a discussion about bargaining power. The basic narrative of what went down at the NATO summit is that Trump got what he wanted. No more European free-riding, and a commitment from Europe to make serious investments in the continent's own defenses. But by doing that, even if the new investments are entirely focused on the alliance's existing complementarities, Europe still buys bargaining power in its bilateral relationship with Washington. All of the focus seems to stay on Europe's coercive bargaining relationship with Russia. But there are also bargaining stakes to be had inside of alliance relations. What is interesting is that we are not yet seeing what Europe will use that additional bargaining power to obtain. Most of the commentary along those lines so far has focused on Europe onshoring some military production, as though that will take away investments from the United States. 2 points. 1. Jumping from 2% to 3.5% core defense spending fattens the materiel pie. So it is possible that both Europe develops a strong military-industrial base, while simultaneously increasing investments across the Atlantic. That will almost certainly be the case in the short run, because whatever you need now cannot come from factories that will not be finished until 2030. Point 2 is that the United States is well aware that Europe will onshore production, and sees that as a feature, not a bug. The United States does not have the industrial capacity to produce what Europe needs. Never mind that the United States would benefit from procuring supplies from Europe in a pinch. And so the question remains how Europe will leverage its new bargaining power. And we may not see an answer there for a while. For one thing, Europe needs to follow through on the spending targets before capturing any of the initiative. But for another, Trump is such a wild card that you could imagine that Europe collectively leaves the situation be for the time being. Nonetheless, Trump will not be around forever, and if whoever comes next has a more standard political disposition, Europe will still have some more bargaining leverage, and so maybe we will see something then. Until then, you can always read a couple of awesome books about how we got here. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.